one of the conflicts going on in trying to deal with homelessness, and particularly among Housing First and talking about supportive housing, is that there have been a couple of different ways of talking about people who are living on the streets. One of the focuses has been on who are the high-cost users. And these costs, you can see actually 80% of these costs are healthcare, hospital and ER visits. And that's a huge factor. But there are also some costs missing from this that I'll talk about in a minute. But over here, one of the issues, this study started with the question of who's vulnerable. So really looking at people who are living on the streets who have serious health conditions that make them vulnerable to dying on the streets. And that's where this framework started. And the reality is that there are a lot of homeless people who are very vulnerable who aren't costing us a lot of money because they stay out of the system. They intentionally, for paranoia and for a variety of other reasons, they don't want anything to do with the system. They've had bad experiences with the system, so they really aren't very expensive. But between the two of them, one of the key issues in all of this stuff talking about cost savings, here we had these 28 people that saved $3.7 million. What happened to those money? What happened to that money? And how can we capture that money and use it to build the kind of housing that would work for everybody, even people that are not high-cost users and that don't need high-cost interventions. So, one of the big problems that we have in San Diego is the development of affordable housing. And, that $3.7 million, had we been able to capture that and leverage it with other kinds of federal and state money to build more housing, we could go a long ways toward solving some of these homeless problems. How does San Diego's experience compare to other communities? And one of the biggest differences between San Diego and the two really landmark communities in California, which are Los Angeles and Santa Clara, is that in both of these communities, these costs include public hospitals. In San Diego, these hospitals are all private hospitals. And that's part of the reason why San Diego County hasn't felt the same pressure to get engaged on this issue, because in Los Angeles and in Santa Clara, a huge part of this cost profile are the costs that are hitting in the county hospital. So the county really feels the pain very directly. Whereas in San Diego, these are all private hospitals, and they're different hospitals. It's no one hospital getting the whole burden. So it's been difficult in San Diego to focus the attention in the same way that we've had in other communities. But I mentioned that there was a piece missing from this Project 25. If you look at this chart, it's 64% of the costs were hospital inpatient costs, 22% ER visits, and then here's this 3% jail days. That's just the cost of being in jail. When you come over here and you look at this Los Angeles, this green bar, that's medical costs in jail. A lot of these folks that are in jail have mental health issues and physical health issues and require medical attention when they're in jail. And jail is, I would say, the most expensive and least effective place to deliver health care. And actually, when you look at the cost savings in LA, the biggest single cost savings was virtually eliminating that cost of medical care in jail. When you get down into permanent supportive housing, that cost goes away. These healthcare costs, in addition to that cost going away, the hospital costs and the ER costs go down because now people are in a health home, so they're getting their primary medical care from a clinic that's equipped to deal with that, and that's a lot less expensive venue to deliver health care. And the same dynamic is true over here in Santa Clara County, that there's a big part of that cost profile, particularly of the most expensive folks who have the most complex problems, when they end up in jail, those costs are totally general fund dollars for the county. The county can't pass that cost on to anybody else. They can't bill it to Medicare, they can't bill it to Medicaid or Medi-Cal, they can't bill it to private insurance. It's just all county dollars. Well, you know, San Diego has that same issue. We just don't see it. We haven't figured out how to capture that cost and how to identify it. And that's part of the, you know, kind of the power of the sort of data matching that Dan Fleming talks about, that was done in Santa Clara and Los Angeles, that enables you to really figure out who are the people that are using multiple systems and that are causing us to spend our money in very ineffective ways. So, you know, one of the other things we looked at, because this issue became so clear in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Board of Supervisors said, well, how much are we really spending on people who are homeless in Los Angeles? And in one of these studies in 2014, 2015, they identified 150,000 people who were homeless in Los Angeles at some point in that period of time, and the total public cost was almost $1 billion. That's billion with a B. Over $900 million was spent on that population of folks, and very few of them actually ended up in housing. Now, if we could get people into housing where they're getting services at community-based care and in neighborhoods, and get their lives stabilized, we would be spending a lot less than that. And we could use, if we can figure out how to, one, spend less than that, and then two, capture what we're saving and redirect it to housing, then we stand a chance of, you know, dealing with this whole population of folks, even the ones that aren't most expensive. San Diego has not had the same kind of in-depth look at all of its costs. We haven't figured out how to do the data matching and really spend the time and effort to capture the same kind of cost profile that they've done in Los Angeles and Santa Clara. Nonetheless, San Diego leadership is figuring out that this is an expensive problem. So there are a couple things going on in San Diego now that we're all watching. One is Project One for All, that's specifically addressing this psychiatric hospitalization. So it's really trying to identify, was it 1,200? 1,200 people who are on the streets who have severe mental health issues, and to try to get them into housing. Both the city and the county are committing housing resources in addition to healthcare resources to try to identify those folks and get them off the streets and into housing. The other thing that's going on in San Diego right now is looking at the population in general that are incurring a lot of other kinds of healthcare costs, both in ER visits and in private hospitalization. And it's a project called the Whole Person Wellness Initiative. That's a pilot project that's going to try to identify 250
people a year.
So it's going to try to identify the 200 most expensive users of the healthcare system who are homeless, and then provide intensive wraparound services, outreach and engagement to identify who those folks are and get them enrolled, and then hopefully figure out some way to do the housing match. And that's going to be the hardest part in San Diego. And then, you know, just one other thing about both of these. Well, let's look at this Santa Clara. This chart, what this does is it takes the expensive, high-cost users of healthcare, or, well, just not healthcare, but emergency room clinic, hospitalization, mental health services, ambulance transports, drug and alcohol services, all the costs that are being incurred. And what it looks at is, okay, if you were to take all those costs, who are the 5% of that population that are most expensive? And they're costing over $100,000 a year. And they're still on the streets, which is just absurd, because the cost of putting them into permanent supportive housing is at best somewhere around $20,000, maybe $30,000, all in. But then the next 5%, you see there, $31,000 a year. But then down here, there's a part of this cohort that was only costing the county $152 a year. So they're actually not more expensive to leave them on the streets. So this curve that goes like this, it's called a hockey stick because it looks like a hockey stick. And it's the same thing that happens in LA and other communities, that the vast majority of homeless people are costing this much, and then that goes up, and then there's this very key spike where really about 20% of the homeless population are incurring this vast amount of public costs. If you look at the whole realm of costs in Los Angeles, the county looked at 150,000 adults who experienced homelessness in LA County between 2004, or in the fiscal year of 2014-15. So that's 1 year. And in 1 year, that 150,000 people incurred almost $1 billion of public costs. And that included everything from general relief to health services, mental health services, child welfare services, sheriff costs, jail costs, probation costs. So the county is spending $1 billion a year while people are still on the streets. And so there's a huge amount of money that we're not spending in a very smart way. And San Diego's number is not that high. Los Angeles has probably 40,000 people per night, 45,000 people per night are homeless. In San Diego, it's probably around 9,000, maybe a little less. But over the course of a year, that probably means that somewhere around 30,000 people in San Diego County experience homelessness. So our costs aren't going to be anywhere near $1 billion. But when you look at the fact that 28 people, very conservatively, cost $3.5 million in 1 year, we're spending a lot of money. And one of the things that none of these, this Project 25 tried to capture arrest costs, and it's basically a booking fee. So every time a city police officer picks up a homeless person, puts them in the car, and takes them and books them in the county jail, the city pays a booking fee to the county. But what we weren't able to capture is the cost of the police officer's time, the gas, the depreciation on the police vehicle. I mean, there are a lot of costs. And one of the things that Chris mentioned earlier is, when you look at these ambulance costs, when somebody calls 911 and says there's a homeless person collapsed on the street, they don't just send an ambulance. They send a fire truck with 3 or 4 people in it. There's a police car, and then finally an ambulance comes and picks the person up and transports them. All that we captured in this study was the cost of the ambulance. We didn't cost out the fire truck, the 3 fire personnel sitting in the fire truck, the paramedic that's in the fire truck, the police officer's time. None of that was captured. So these costs are undoubtedly much higher than what we had found there.
I have a girlfriend who lives in Golden Hill, and she has a lot of physical problems. She calls the paramedics a lot. And I noticed, being homeless, that the number 11 fire truck comes there about 3 times a day. And I thought, what if they're down here when she needs them? And she could die. I mean,
Yeah, that's an important point, because one of the things that these, we identify in the cost studies is when we get that homeless person who's constantly getting transported by the ambulance, when we get that person off the streets and into housing, not only are we saving the cost of intervention, but we're allowing those public systems to do what they're supposed to do, which is meet everybody else's needs.
And the police too, that were down there arresting and taking. Their time's horrible. I'm sure they have other more important things to do.
Right.
Yeah, we in Project 25 we looked at so 28 people. They had roughly, I want to say, about 800 ambulance rides throughout the course of a year. So that means that these 28 people, in 1 year, every single day there was over 2 ambulances.
Oh yeah, that's
just picking up this group of 28 people, and so right they, when we look at response times and all that kind of stuff, it's like, well, those 28 people every day, just, put it on the books. 2 ambulance rides, we're going to go for those 28.
Well, one of the big issues in San Diego right now is how do you reduce the response time for citizens who need help? And they call 911 and nobody's there to help. Well, one of the ways you decrease the response time is you get rid of these useless, repetitive calls that aren't solving the problem.
It can be preventable with housing and services.
Yeah, that's true.
I think, especially related to this, I think one important thing is that the cost of homelessness is really just one dimension of why we need to solve this problem. Yes, people who are experiencing homelessness do cost our communities a lot of money, but that shouldn't be the sole reason why we want to solve the problem. More importantly, it's a humanitarian issue, it's a human rights issue, and all that. So I think it's it's important that we look at this stuff, but it's just one dimension.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's always impressed me about supportive housing, it's really a win-win-win. It saves public costs, it improves the quality of life for the people who get into housing, it improves their health status, and it also improves the quality of life in the neighborhood because you don't have people camping out on the streets. It's not just that it's uncomfortable. I mean, it really creates stress in the neighborhood when you have these encampments. And to have a way to solve that is really important. I guess the other, one of the things that we haven't talked about because we focus a lot on this cost issue is that just in homelessness in general, I think it's really important to remember that a big driving factor is the shift between what we call baseline wages and baseline housing. In 1968, 1970, you could, on 3 or 4 hours of work at minimum wage, anywhere in the country, you could buy 1 week's worth of housing. It wouldn't be great housing. It would be flop houses, cage hotels. By 1980, 85, that scenario, it took 4.5 days of work at minimum wage, 1 week's worth of housing. It's gotten a little better in San Diego. It's now about 3.5 days. So basically what's happened in our economy is that we have shifted the cost of housing. The cost of housing has gone way up. The cost of wages, the amount of wages hasn't kept pace. And that basic economic issue of poverty is underneath all of this stuff. And particularly all these folks that are homeless that don't have all these health issues, it's still basically a cost, it's an economic problem. But the reality is if we don't solve that economic problem, the longer these people are on the streets, the more they're going to develop these high cost problems. Because you're going to have post-traumatic stress, you're going to develop alcohol and drug issues as a way of trying to deal with the pain and discomfort of being on the streets. You're going to develop all kinds of mental health issues. You're going to have victims of violence. You're going to have diabetes. You're going to have foot problems. You're going to have all kinds of problems that are going to, these folks that aren't costing much, leave them on the streets. 8 years from now, they'll be costing a lot of money.
I'm amazed at how many people are actually involved in this issue and trying to solve it. You guys, and we were at the United Way the other day, and the lady broke down in tears. She said, "I've been trying for 15 years, and I'm sorry the system has let you down." And she was sincere. I'm just amazed, about it.
Yeah, there are some real champions in San Diego that have been engaged in this long time. But one of the other things that we've learned different places around the country, in communities where they're making a significant difference in terms of reducing the number of people who are homeless on the streets, there's key assertive leadership from political leaders and business leaders in addition to the nonprofit sector. So all the cities like Houston, Salt Lake City, these cities that have actually achieved dramatic reductions in the number of people who are homeless, you're going to find in those cities strong political leadership on this issue and strong business community leadership on this issue. And then in addition to that, support from the philanthropic community and the social service providers. Yeah, you've touched on a really important question in a lot of communities that have been doing permanent supportive housing for a long time. Communities like New York, Chicago, and now some in Los Angeles have developed initiatives that they're calling moving on. And it's basically recognizing, one of the things that Chris talked about is that when Project 25 folks, when they've been in housing, a number of them are going to need intensive support forever. But there are others who get into that housing and the right kind of services, their lives stabilize, their health status improves, and they may not be able to be employable and be financially independent, but they could probably move into more independent housing in the community with a Section 8 voucher or some other kind of rental voucher. We don't have good data that shows us what that number of people would be. But it's clear that there are people, that people in permanent supportive housing, their lives do stabilize and they do move into other settings. One of the challenges for doing that is that the supportive housing is really affordable. And if we had other affordable housing options in the community, it would make it easier for people to move on. But we don't really have a lot of really good data that helps us analyze, okay, if you have 100 units of supportive housing, after 5 years, how many people in that housing will move on to some other kind of housing setting? It would be important to know that, but we don't as yet have that data.
I think another interesting thing that's really catching on more is rapid rehousing. So the idea of rapid rehousing is has kind of, it's evolved over the years, but it really started out as a pretty limited rental assistance paired with pretty limited support once in housing, with the idea that in time someone would take on the rent and they wouldn't need the support anymore. But I think as communities learn more about rapid rehousing, learn how to do it better, is there ways to use rapid rehousing, which is not a long-term investment like supportive housing, in ways that could start addressing maybe not Project 25 like folks, but maybe people kind of, like Jonathan, lower down on the hockey stick curve, and I think so. It's an interesting time. Again, nationally, we're learning more about rapid rehousing. We're learning what that package of services really looks like, because it's very different than our traditional approaches to doing homeless services like transitional housing. But I think it's an exciting thing for communities to really look at, is can they use something like rapid rehousing to start addressing higher acuity people, higher cost people, and I think.
Yeah, and actually, clear back in the early 1990s, Nan Roman, who's the executive director of the National Alliance to End Homelessness, talked about one of the things that we were learning back then is that if you looked at the homeless system as kind of a house, there were all these people coming into the homeless system through the front door, and there was no good back door to get them into any kind of permanent housing, and people were getting stuck just in that system. And so one of the things that she began saying is that we need to find ways to make the back door bigger, that move people on, but also close the front door. And that means not that we stop helping people, but that we realize there's a more effective intervention than putting people into shelter and transitional housing. So what are our prevention tools? How do we identify somebody very early on who's in a crisis, who with rapid rehousing and a fairly minimal investment, you could avoid them ever having to get into shelter and transitional housing and getting stuck in this kind of system that's not very effective. And so that's really kind of how the rapid rehousing model emerged, was a way of